right, I'm here at Magfest with game designers Bryan Depuy and Nick Beauregard. Thank you for speaking with me.
Of course.
I'd like to start by asking about this game that you have here. Tell me about it.
Okay, so our game is called BitRat, and it's a cyberpunk puzzle game where you play an artificial intelligence that's trying to escape from the corporation that created it. And it's our sort of big premise was we wanted to move away from the evil, power-hungry AI trope towards an AI that was a little more benign and curious and almost childlike, just trying to sort of make sense of the world around it as it explores the sort of corporate data net.
Now, have you guys worked on other games, or is this your...
This is our first serious kind of long-term project. We both dabbled in little prototypes, and I've worked on a couple smaller games since we started this, but this is our primary project.
Oh, okay. And I guess you're play testing it still? It's still under development?
Well, so what we brought to Magfest this year is actually essentially a standalone prologue to the main game. So it's about the first act of the story, and it introduces all the characters, the core mechanics, a couple of the variants that we've developed. And our idea is actually to release this standalone prologue and then sort of use the feedback we get from that to push through the rest of development. And, we expect this is about a quarter of the final game.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how will you know when it's finished? What, do you have a plan or a goal?
We've got we know where the story goes, so we've got that figured out. And we know we want roughly 40 or so levels in the completed game. And it's just a matter of spacing out the story and weaving it into the levels in a way that makes sense.
Do you feel like, as far as the art and music and that sort of thing, the visual and audio elements, are those set or still?
I think those are fairly polished at this point. Yeah,
we did a lot of iteration over the visual style of the game early on.
Yeah,
and I think we finally settled on something that really works.
So I noticed visually it sort of looks like an old-time computer, sort of, but obviously it's a sort of futuristic concept. So that's kind of interesting.
Well, so we actually, the game takes place in 1991, but it's sort of like a goofy, retro future 1991, where there's wireless networking and subcutaneous BioWare, but the aesthetic and the sort of, trappings of the corporation are kind of out of early 90s sort of corporate mythology. So we played pretty fast and loose with it. We just sort of liked the idea that we would take this aesthetic and build up a mythos that, felt like it was the way people in the early 90s thought the future was going to be. And we just sort of incorporated that.
Yeah, I kind of like the way that cyberpunk, the aesthetic that cyberpunk had at that time, the late 80s, early 90s. I'd say a lot of my favorite cyberpunk films and books and stuff like that, or games were released around that time. And so I guess we're kind of retroactively adopting that aesthetic.
But with some of the, obviously we're working in a modern game engine and stuff like that, so we're not actually constrained. Right. Our palette isn't constrained, our audio isn't actually constrained, so we're sort of we sort of gave ourselves constraints and we're we'll observe these until it's too much of a nuisance, and then we'll flex them a little bit,
Okay. So what inspires each of you as far as creating games?
I think, I think for me personally, working on video games is a really great intersection of a lot of other kinds of creative work that I'm interested in. There's a design element, there's a narrative element, there's an artistic element, a visual arts element, there's an audio element, and I think being able to work on a project that integrates all of those things seamlessly is really exciting. And in terms of collaboration, me and Nick have known each other 25 years and have been working on, we were in bands together and we've made movies together all through high school and stuff like that. So we've been collaborating in one form or another for a really long time, and I think getting to continue to work on something with Nick is also just an awesome inspiration to do that.
What sort of so your movies and music, what sort of themes did you guys follow or apply?
Sort of suburban alienation. We're sort of in punk bands together and stuff like that.
Yeah, most of that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So what about, do you have where are your creative inspirations?
Wow. I mean, too many to name, I guess, but like with this project specifically, puzzle games are one of my favorite genre of games. Particularly as I get older, I feel like I don't do as well with action games anymore, and I just when I have time to play video games, I like to just sit and have a more calm, like thoughtful experience with them.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that you designed a lot of the puzzles, or is it kind of a mix of?
No, it's like
we've both worked on everything. Yeah,
with the exception of the music. Brian did all the music. I'm not as musically inclined, but otherwise we both do everything.
Yeah, we do a lot of, and we'll sort of trade off. Like one of us will work on one element of the game for a while until we get sick of it, and then kind of hand it off, and then we just keep swapping. And like I've learned, I feel like I started this project with much less of a kind of grounding in programming than Nick did, and I've sort of learned to do that over the course of the project, which has also been really cool.
What is your most important designing or development tool? Is there something special you need in your workspace?
I guess I would say for me, it's just like having uninterrupted time to think about it, and to move into and out of the space of working on the game. It can be difficult, like when I got a million other things going on in my life. So I think like for me, just like having a creative practice and being like every day I'm going to commit some amount of time to doing uninterrupted work on this game, and I'm going to do my best to not let other parts of my life like directly invade that is like for me one of the most like essential parts of the practice. It's just like I'm going to commit to this every day, even if it's just for half an hour.
Yeah. Same for you.
Yeah, I'd say that's the biggest challenge for me is trying to fit it in.
Yeah.
So what programming languages have you learned, or did
Just in general?
Yeah.
So I got into programming through kind of an unusual vector. I started with embedded systems and learning C for 8-bit microcontrollers. And actually the first video game project I ever worked on was writing an Arkanoid clone in assembly for an 8-bit microcontroller that generated the whole video signal and all that. And then I got into programming professionally as well, and learned other high-level languages like Python and JavaScript and stuff like that. And Brian got into programming through this project. This game.
The BitRat is designed using GameMaker, which is a framework that has its own kind of C-like-ish proprietary scripting language that isn't quite as robust as like a proper programming language, but it certainly helped me understand all the basic structures and logic flow and stuff like that. So it's a good jump-off point if you don't know what you're doing yet. Yeah.
Is there an element of game design that you enjoy working on the most, and why?
I think for me, it's finding it's developing balance between elements. It's like we had the mechanic for BitRat established very early on. Like the core puzzle was there, from like the first prototype, and I think like we had this strong sense that we wanted to incorporate a narrative into it, but we weren't really sure how to do that, and we sort of iterated over like. For a while, the story was kind of just like an abstraction that we would tell people about, and then we kind of had like a heavy-handed, like too much text, like bookending the puzzles, and then we were like, how can we actually integrate these? And so I think for me, like getting the story in there in a way that feels natural and not just like we're dumping a volume of text on you, and then you play an unrelated puzzle, and then we dump more text on you. Getting it to a point where you're like, oh, I'm actually just like I just feel like I'm participating in this developing story is like for me like probably the most compelling aspect of design.
I think for me, I like probably working on like the core mechanics of the game the most. Taking it from just like an abstract idea of a puzzle and then implementing that in code to something that can be playable, even if it's rough and not necessarily the greatest user experience, but just getting the logic of the puzzle system actually in code I find very fun.
Now, how did you start making games, and why do you make games?
We were on a camping trip like 4 or 5 years ago, and we're both originally from the DC area, and Nick still lives around here, and I moved up to Toronto about 6 years ago, and we were like trying to figure out a project we could work on remotely, and and that, sort of engaged all of these interests that we've had, and we were like, oh, we should make a video game, because like we like video games and we don't necessarily play a ton of them anymore, but like this seems like a cool thing that we could do together, and that was sort of like the initial spark. And for me, I think, like I said before, like what keeps me going is just like I can take all these things I'm already interested in and blend them into this one project, and like I've just started to kind of like make a sort of lateral movement towards doing it like somewhat more professionally, and like seeking grant money and stuff like that to work on new projects. So like now I'm like, okay, I can actually maybe center this in my life a little more than I first thought, which is really cool.
Yeah, I'd say that pretty much covers it. That games being completely digital made it a good fit for something we could collaborate on, being hundreds of miles apart from each other with, Google Hangouts and Bitbucket and all that stuff.
I'd say we're also both like bad long-distance communicators, so it's nice to have like a day every week where it's like, we're going to talk about the game. So it's like, if it was just like, let's just catch up, like we'd probably wait months because we're just bad at it. But like, having the game, it's like every couple of weeks, okay, let's talk, and and we end up spending half that time just like talking about our lives anyway, so it's nice.
That's totally true.
Yeah, nice. How did your first game development experience that felt really strong or powerful, what was that, and how did it change your process as far as developing a game?
I mean, I think for me it was when, we'd come up with this sort of premise for this game, but didn't really have any kind of prototype or like solid playable thing yet. And Nick went away for like 2 weeks over like the holidays or something several years ago, and basically just made the prototype. And like, I guess I was visiting town or something like that, and Nick was like, oh, I gotta show you this prototype I made of the idea that we've been talking about. And like, for me, that was like, holy crap, this is like, now it's a game, and you can play through this first puzzle that Nick came up with. And I think for me, like, that was like a moment of like cohesion where we like had this idea that wasn't implemented in any way, and we thought it was a cool idea, but like actually sitting down and playing it and being like, oh, we can do this, and it's gonna be incremental, it's gonna be a tiny, we're gonna take baby steps from this prototype to this, kind of polished product that we have, and that was like a really inspiring moment to be like, oh, we can do this. It's like,
yeah, I'd say my experience is kind of similar. Probably in just watching other people play the game after Brian and I started working on it together and got it to, because when Brian first played it, like it was just barely playable. Like you could play it, but it wasn't fun. And getting it to a state where we could show it to people who we didn't know, who weren't familiar with the game, could just sit down and play it and have a good time. That's amazing to me. That we made this thing and it's a game that people can play.
Let's see, what role do games or the game developer have in society?
Oh, that's a tricky question.
A philosophical one.
I mean, I think people who make games are like any other kind of creative, producer, creative artist, or kind of like culture producer in some ways, in that like, I think, personally, I think if you make things, the best thing the best way to go about that is to bring as much of your like honest whole self into that process as you can, as like, so that the thing that you make, whether it's a game or a piece of visual art or a piece of writing, like resonates with people at a level deeper than just like this is a product for you to consume, and I think like, I know for me, like all of the video games and other kinds of art that I've consumed that really stuck with me was stuff where I felt like somebody was like reaching across this void and like, like grabbing hold of some internal part of me and like, either making me feel validated or freaking me out or what, like they're just really like getting to me in some way. And I think like, I would like to believe that game developers have the capacity as artists or whatever to like do that kind of engagement with people in a way that, maybe makes you think a little differently about your life or your identities or, like where the world is going. So.
Yeah, same thing. Feel the same. what movies, books, games, or other creative media in science fiction or fantasy have inspired you?
Again, like too many to name, but I'd say for a project like this,
if you're doing AI, I mean, I can think of certain evil and good.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I mean, books like Neuromancer and the Sprawl trilogy from Beauregard and Gibson. Games in just puzzle design. A game I played fairly recently, The Witness. Although our game bears very little resemblance in any significant way to that game. I really enjoyed that one and found just a lot of inspiration in the way the puzzle mechanics were introduced and figuring out the puzzles became a part of the puzzle itself. Let's go on and on.
Okay. And how about you?
So yeah, a lot of similar stuff, and I think for me, like, my access point to sort of science fiction novels and stuff as an adult has been, like, I really love Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, a lot of kind of like feminist science fiction, and I really like the way that, I think one of the most exciting things for me was this idea of like taking cyberpunk, which is, has some tropes, and being like, how can we use these tropes in a way where people are like, oh, I recognize this is cool, there's an AI, and there's like a corporation, and like evil, and just like messing with those in a way where people are like, oh, I didn't expect this story to have emotional resonance, I didn't expect this AI to be so like empathetic, or I didn't expect that like, the humans would sort of like have certain dynamics between them socially or whatever, and I think like, so I think for me, like, Nicola Griffith is another writer. She wrote a book called Slow River that I really love. It's sort of like, it's almost like I feel like she does a lot of stuff where she takes this sort of like police procedural style and like infuses it with all this sort of dystopian kind of social dynamics and stuff so I think that was like, that sort of like revisionist cyberpunk thing is really interesting to me, and I wanted to carry some of that into the game.
Okay. Did either of you, what's that game, Shadowrun?
Yeah.
I played a lot of Shadowrun on SNES growing up. I'd say, that's definitely definitely an influence.
What kind of character? I don't know the characters they had.
So on SNES, I don't know how much it resembled the
pen and paper
RPG, because I haven't played that one, but you weren't allowed to choose your character. It was just there was this character assigned to you.
I think you were just a hacker, basically.
Okay.
So you spent a lot of time on that one?
Yeah, it was one of those things where back then, like, at least for me, I only had a few games, and so the games that I had were the games that I played a lot, and those came from like garage sales or wherever, and so Shadowrun was one of those.
Any others you remember?
Any other games?
Those few games you said.
Flashback on SNES. That was a great one. I mean, not that it's super relevant, but like I played a lot of Mario.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool. Well, so same with you. You said I guess you played it.
Yeah, and I played it. I like point and click adventure games were kind of like what I got my teeth on. So like a lot of the old Sierra like text parser stuff was like those were the first games that like I really dug into, and I thought they were like infinite when I was a kid. Because I would just I never like drew maps or anything. I would just like wander around the world, and I went back and played a lot of them actually as an adult, and was like, oh, it's like 30 screens in the whole game. But when I was 9, this was endless.
Yeah.
And I love that. I was like, oh, I want to, that's another element that I think, I love that kind of sleight of hand that you can do in games where you make people feel like the world is much, much bigger and deeper than it actually is,
Yeah. Something's behind the wall.
Yeah, exactly.
Without really.
Yeah.
I'd say later on I got really into strategy role-playing games.
Oh, yeah?
And I think that got me more interested in puzzles in general. Just when you strip the time component out of games, and it's just about thinking, and you have as much time as you want to process what's going on, and then provide your input.
Yeah.
I sort of gravitate to games like that now.
Oh yeah. Right.
And this game has no real time component to it. You have as much time to complete the puzzles as you want. You can step back and put it aside for a while, think about it, come back to it.
so it can end up absorbing your thinking maybe.
Yeah.
Go to work and you're thinking about it.
So like The Witness, for example, I have like a notebook full of sketches that I'd be thinking about the puzzle and I'd sketch it out, sit there staring at it on the bus, and then come home from work and have a solution for it.
Hopefully we can scratch a little bit of the same itch.
Yeah. So if you didn't have any restrictions on you, what game would you like to create? You know, either big or small, or you know.
We actually started working on this game because we had an idea that we foresaw as being too complex, which I think we would like to return. I don't know if it's like the ultimate game that we would ever make, but like it's sort of like more of an adventure game with like an exploration component that also incorporated a lot of these kind of like sort of schematic sort of like crafting puzzles and I think like basically a game that takes this puzzle stuff that we've been kind of digging into more deeply and adds like a broader kind of exploratory element to something that we'd really like to do in the future. You know, where we're not as like, you know, in BitRat, like the world is just this sort of abstraction. Right. And I think we'd like to do something where, you know, you're exploring like a planet or something like that, and you're encountering alien technologies and trying to reverse engineer them, and like so we said we would preserve the puzzle stuff, but it would be couched in a much more maybe not epic, but you know, a grander narrative.
Yeah, or like just a more kind of open experience. So, you know, BitRat is very on rails, and I think it works in that. But I would like the opportunity to make a game that's where the world's more open and the players
maybe the narrative has a few more branches to it.
Yeah. Where exploration is more of a central component.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you guys have any final thoughts or comments or?
I'd say, one game that just came to me when I was thinking that I didn't mention earlier in inspirations, games that inspire me would be Portal. I really like that one in the way that it took a really cool puzzle idea and told a story through the puzzle mechanics, and everything was connected. It wasn't like it wasn't just this abstract puzzle with a story in between. It was like the puzzles took place in the world, and it told the story through the puzzle systems. And I thought they just did a really excellent job with that in a way that a lot of puzzle games don't attempt to. And that was very inspirational for this.
All right. So as far as this game then, where can you find more information? Or
so we actually our sort of game studio is called Bucketdrum Games, and we have a website. It's just www.bucketdrumgames.com. Bucketdrum Games. Okay. Yeah, and we have a trailer up there and a little bit of information about BitRat, and we're also so when we release this standalone episode, which we're hoping to do very, very soon, we'll have information there about where you can get it on itch.io, that'll probably be the hub for now. And we have a Twitter account at Bucketdrum Games. So and I think maybe a final thought that I would add is just I think for me, like one of the most important elements of doing this and making a game is also about like connecting with other people who either make games or just like are interested in games as a way of like starting conversations about interesting stuff. And so like I really hope that we can do that with BitRat. It's not just something that people play and say, oh, that was a game, I'm done with it. But maybe they play it and they think like, or like, who are the weirdos that made this game? Like, I want to have a conversation with them about why they did this way. So like, hopefully we can stimulate a little bit of dialogue.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for talking to us.
Please visit chrisalvarez.com for more cool stuff. You can also find my website and social media information in the podcast show notes. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the future.